Um, my name is Karma Elliott, and I'm a member of the UK Trade and Business Commission. I'll be chairing this session on UK and EU relations in the world. Our chair, Andrew Lewin, MP, is on separate parliamentary business this morning and sends his apologies. But we have today. So we have Olivia O'Sullivan, Professor Phillips O'Brien, and Ben Judah. Olivia O'Sullivan is the director of the UK in the World programme at Chatham House. Professor Phillips O'Brien is the Professor of Strategic Studies at the University of St Andrews. And Ben Judah is an author and former advisor and researcher. So we have an excellent panel of witnesses to give evidence today. We have a very big topic, a wide-ranging topic. So I suggest we get started. I'll ask the first question, and we'll pass round the table of the commissioners as we go through the main topics. So welcome everybody. Thank you to our witnesses for joining us this morning, and look forward very much to the discussion. So to get us started, I'd like to ask you all, how have major geopolitical developments, particularly Russia's war in Ukraine, instability, of course, that we're seeing in the Middle East, and uncertainty in transatlantic politics, changed the strategic incentives for the UK and EU to cooperate more closely? So perhaps if I ask Olivia to get us started.
Sure, happy to, and thanks very much for having me. I hope I can offer some useful thoughts to the Commission today. So maybe just to start off in answering this question, I think it's worth saying that even prior to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the events of the second Trump administration, there was a recognition in UK strategy that our defence and security capabilities and interests were shifting. Particularly if you look at the integrated review or the kind of foreign policy, security and defence strategies of the early 2020s, there was this recognition that Russia was the most proximate and most concerning security threat to the UK. And therefore, our defence and security focus needed to shift to Europe. That's significant because for the 20 years prior to that, UK defence capabilities and security strategies were structured around this idea of the war on terror, right? So the structure of our defence involved the idea that the UK would often be playing an expeditionary or a complementary role in a US-led mission or a US-led strategic approach in kind of battling global terrorism. There was already this sense that we needed to start thinking about how do we build defence capabilities and how do we shift our security focus in such a way that deals with the fact that our most proximate and serious threat is a fellow state in Europe. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but also its repeated statements of extraterritorial ambition, its repeated cyber and hybrid attacks on European countries, accelerate, renew, make it clear that that threat is critical. The US has now, it did before Trump, but it is doing so much more urgently and abruptly, repeatedly signaled that it will, whether it does so gradually or whether it does so painfully, withdraw from its previous role in guaranteeing European security. And that has the strategic effect of weakening the deterrent effect of NATO because it undermines confidence in what the US would do if a NATO ally were compromised or attacked. But it also leaves Europe practically exposed because of the role US defence capabilities play in European security. I think it's worth just emphasising this point because in my own view, it's important to say that, you know, many European militaries it's not that they're not significant or that they wouldn't provide significant capabilities if there were a crisis in Europe, but the framework that they've been working in has been American. So particularly capabilities like intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, logistical capabilities, they're big bits of kit that move other bits of kit. those have been American. The kind of enabling framework that our militaries have been designed around and operated in have been American. And that's the kind of slightly difficult thing to replace. And the prospect of those capabilities either not being provided in a crisis or being drawn down is what leaves Europe with a gap. That is a shared risk and a shared strategic interest between the EU and the UK. So it's imperative. Sorry, I'll wrap up and let others speak, but it's imperative that Europe spend more on defence, do more to protect itself. And I think the reason the EU is important in this is that a really critical area for cooperation for me is spending and is procurement. The EU has not always traditionally been a defence actor. Maybe it will turn into more of a defence actor in future, but it has shown enormous creativity when it comes to fiscal policy, and there's real firepower and there's real potential around the ways in which the EU and the UK together could think differently about European defence spending and European defence procurement. And that's where I think there is probably significant opportunity. Some of the measures that I'm sure we'll get into, the SAFE programme and the other prospects for cooperation, are promising and interesting, but some of them are time bound and some of them are sort of ad hoc responses to crisis. And I think there's prospects for thinking differently about how we institutionalise joint spending and joint procurement. There's plenty of other geopolitical developments we could talk about, but I think the primary one is the exposure of gaps in European defence that comes from the US volatility and comes from the fact that our most proximate and serious threat is Russia. And I think that's where the focus should be.
Sorry. Thank you, Olivia. And Phillips, would you like to pick up the conversation from there?
Sure. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this group. I think even we're being too polite in the way this question is being framed and the way we're talking about it. There's one great problem, and that is that the United States is no longer the United States upon which all of European and British defense have been based for a generation. I would even go so far as to say the United States might be a threat to Europe right now. And that needs to be faced. It's not a transatlantic relationship problem. It's a transformation of the United States from a security guarantor to Europe to a threat to European sort of liberal democracy. And we might see that very, very soon, by the way, in the election results in Hungary that are going to come up in the next few days. What is happening in the Middle East and even what is happening in Ukraine, I think, is partly secondary to that. Because what is happening in Ukraine, by the way, is being heavily influenced by the United States transforming to what it is. So I do think there needs to be a lot more honesty in the discussion about what the UK and European states are facing. Because if we can't speak honestly about the challenge that we're facing, the preparations will be what we have seen, which are very limited, not going nearly as far down the road as they need to towards coordination, and not, I would think, thinking strategically for the future. So is this, do they need more cooperation? Of course, they need far deeper cooperation than they're doing. They need some kind of institutional framework for that cooperation, be it a coalition of the willing. It can't be NATO, because NATO is a stalking horse for the United States. There is a reasonable argument now that NATO is undermining European security and cannot be seen as a vehicle for doing it. The EU cannot be the institution for European security because the UK is not in it. So there needs to be some other method to approach this question, but it is incumbent that it be addressed as quickly as possible. I don't think there can be any gambling on the USA, quote unquote, going back. I've heard that, oh, maybe we'll have 3 years of Trump and go back. There is no guarantee on that. And even if it goes back for one term, there's no way to say in 8 years' time we won't be back in this kind of situation. So the need for change is drastic. I don't believe it's being faced, and I think we are in trouble.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll ask Ben now to pick up the conversation from there, but quite a spectrum of views there. So could you offer your evidence, Ben?
Thank you so much for having me to speak today. It's a real pleasure to speak to this esteemed group, and thank you so much for doing the work that you are doing. I'd like to speak about our America problem, our Europe problem, and then our British problem in succession, if that's all right.
Please.
The America problem that I believe we face is as follows. The superpower around which we have built our entire security has become erratic, unpredictable, unreliable, and deeply emotional. The United States in the 21st century is not the United States in the late 20th century. That country in the past had a deep bipartisan consensus on foreign policy. That doesn't mean that both parties always agreed on every aspect of foreign policy, but on the main contours of how America related to its main allies and its main foes, there was a deep sense of agreement. And there was an understanding that allies would be treated in what we can call the foreign policy paradigm, that there would be little to no interference in another ally's domestic domestic politics, and that the ways in which foreign policy would be conducted would be largely through the official channels. That's now changed. What we've seen with Donald Trump, but not exclusively Donald Trump, is American politicians practicing foreign politics that is becoming more involved in allies' domestic politics and no longer respecting the old rules of yesterday. It's already been mentioned the way that the United States is playing foreign politics in Hungary, but what I believe that we've seen over the Chagos Islands is the British right playing foreign politics in Washington, and Donald Trump seeing himself as the leader of the global populist right and engaging in foreign politics towards the Prime Minister over an issue that in the previous foreign policy paradigm would not have been seen as something that domestic footballs could be kicked around on. Now to talk about our Europe problem as concerns the United Kingdom, I think that there is still a lot of short-termism and a lack of strategic thinking towards the UK in key institutions in Brussels and in certain member states. I think we saw that over the SAFE negotiations and how those were treated by key EU institutions. And I think we also see a lot of short-termism and a lack of really appreciating the gravity of the moment when it comes to these discussions, which Olivia has already mentioned, about the need for common defence borrowing and common defence stockpiling. I think simply because you are a British pro-European like myself, and I proudly call myself that, doesn't mean that we can't call out or mention a lack of strategic thinking or long-term thinking when we encounter it in Brussels. I'd like to talk about our Britain problem now, and I'd like to really focus in on two problems. First is I wholeheartedly agree that defence spending needs to go up. It needs to go up faster. I do think that the dynamics on defence spending in British politics, as we pick up in opinion polls and as is taking place within political parties, are going in the wrong direction. And I think we need to sort of look at that clearly for what it is. And I also think it's important to say that the dynamics in the economy, especially if the full economic shock, geoeconomic shock we expect to come out of the closure of the Straits of Hormuz to take full effect, are going in the wrong direction as well, and that there will be less money available for defence if this full shock impacts us.
Okay, well, thank you, Ben. I think we'll pick up on individual aspects of what you've mentioned. You've each raised there in our following on questions. I'll pass over to Rachel at this stage.
Thank you very much, Karma, and thank you very much to Olivia, Phillips, and Ben for your really insightful contributions so far. I'm tempted to say, why don't you tell us what you really mean in terms of the scale of this, what you're describing to us? I wanted to really move into a bit more detail about what what worry you have most centrally, and whether or not it's in defence or trade, and what does that mean for middle powers like the UK? And let's start with Olivia.
Thank you. So what is your biggest geopolitical worry right now is a tough question anytime, but I think particularly tough this week. I'm tempted to say, how long have you got? I would highlight the concern that all three of us identified in the answer to the first question, right, which is that for the UK in particular, our principal security ally has become volatile and has become unreliable, and it's not totally clear what their future political trajectory would be. So from a very specific UK perspective, that's a really significant shift in our post-war foreign policy underlying structure. And in the kind of goals and orientation that have been directing it for decades. The more sort of immediate thing I would highlight, but I think other witnesses might be better at talking about it than me, is obviously the current situation with Iran and the prospect that it has long-term price shocks in the way that the OPEC shock. Obviously, we're in a very different kind of situation in terms of how dependent we are on fossil fuels and the role they play in the economy. But nonetheless, if you think about the OPEC shock, the political, economic, domestic and international ripples of that were so significant. And the longer the Straits of Hormuz are closed, the longer I think we have really significant attendant economic concerns to deal with, just at the point where we need to be spending more on defence and we need to be thinking more about how we manage that problem. But I'll just highlight another wider geopolitical development because you mentioned trade, and I think it's worth bringing in, which is the shift in the global trade order that sort of occurred alongside the process of us exiting the European Union, which is the kind of growing willingness of great powers, specifically China and the US, to use economic ties and to use trade policies to coerce and extract concessions from other states. I think this actually aligns nicely with what Ben was saying about the shift from a kind of, not just in defense, but in trade too, the shift from a kind of agreed paradigm and agreed ways of interacting, particularly with the US, to a paradigm that's much more unpredictable, much more politicized. Trade tools like tariffs are being used, the administration might justify them on all kinds of different trade terms, but essentially they're being used to extract concessions to coerce other states to get what the Trump administration says it wants. And we also have China increasingly willing to choke off supplies of critical economic inputs in response to political disputes with other states. That makes the whole logic of leaving a wider trade bloc, as we did when we left the EU, flimsier. There's complexity to that because the EU is also exposed to those risks that China and the US use economic ties, use economic dependencies to coerce other states. But it does at least have the capacity to potentially respond in kind, and it has built frameworks to do that. There's a lot more we could get into on that, but I think there's so much that is drawing attention right now that's really urgent, including the crisis in Iran, but this longer term shift in the global trade order, this willingness of states to use economic ties, to weaponize economic ties in the way they have been doing, I think is a particular concern for a country like the UK, very open economy, services dependent, and for other middle powers too, because the risks that we get caught between that kind of great power, economic coercion and volatility. So I'd highlight those things.
Thank you very much, Phillips.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of greatest risk, I'm not going to pick sort of an international event like Iran. The greatest worry and risk I have is that people in the UK and Europe aren't taking this seriously enough and preparing. That what I've seen a positive shift in rhetoric in the last year. So that there is, and particularly in the last 2 months, I think after Greenland, there was a bit of waking up from the fact that the United States was actually threatening to shoot NATO allies in a warlike event, and that maybe people needed to rethink. But what I've not seen beyond the rhetoric and beyond sort of episodic reactions, such as in Greenland, is a serious attempt to plan for European insecurity with the what you call mid-ranking states in a cooperative way. And that I think is terribly worrying because Europe is being pushed and pulled, and in many ways I talk about the UK just within Europe. To talk about the UK on its own is I think partly a problematic construction. Europe will fall or rise together, I'm not sure that the idea that you can look at a separate UK from European response now and say the UK could do anything on its own. I see real worry that European states are being pushed and pulled between the United States and China and don't know how to react. So the US is being threatening tariffs, trying to sort of cow the European states into doing what they want. The Chinese, on the other hand, this I've seen, I'm a member of the EU's high level group, which provides blue sky thinking to the Commission on issues of trade and resilience. The Chinese are actually trying to pretend everything's fine and, oh, you don't need to look after your trade routes and be resilient and, just keep trading with us. And so Europe's being pushed and pulled in, I think, very harmful ways, and therefore it's stopping the preparation. What I would like to see is actual hard-headed thinking on trade security, on supply lines, on using European resources or close to Europe resources to actually make the economies more resilient. And I see a lot of words, but I see very little action on this. And that means that Europe will continue to be extremely vulnerable. So the rhetoric's not bad, the rhetoric's getting better, but my real worry is I don't see much action.
Thank you, Phillips. Ben, it sounds from Olivia and Phillips that it's the relationships and the underlying structural change that is the most worrying, the worrying challenge facing us. Do you agree?
I'd like to talk a little bit about this concept of middle powers, if you don't mind, because I think that there is an opportunity there. I must admit, I think that a lot of the foreign policy debate for the last few years has talked very vaguely, and I think actually a little bit confusingly about middle power relationships and potential relationships that the UK can reach out to as a middle power. My experience in government and my view is that there aren't really a vast amount of middle power relationships that the UK can tap into outside the non-US West to achieve actual strategic things. And we would be much better having a more precise conversation about who the so-called middle powers are that we can build closer, genuinely strategic relationships with, or more than just one or two isolated topics. And for me, that means that we need to have a look at what are the actual categories of middle powers in the non-US West where we can have very deep strategic relationships. And those are essentially the European Union and its member states that are either associates of the European Union with very, very deep structured relationships that tend to follow its foreign policy, such as, Norway, for example, or they are the CANZUK countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. And what it was clear to me in government from working with those countries is that you can achieve a whole set of genuinely deep and strategic things as the UK with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and with European Union countries that you generally can't with a whole category of other states, which one may correctly call middle powers, that are outside that non-US West. There may be certain specific things that you can do with Japan, South Korea, Singapore, but even beyond that, there are not a whole host of quote unquote middle power relationships that are waiting for us to tap into when it comes to genuinely doing strategic geopolitical joint projects to meet these challenges that we are talking about. We're talking about today. One thing that I have come to feel quite strongly about is that there is currently in the UK a sort of politically quite negative debate where figures on the centre and left talk only about potential deeper cooperation with the EU. Figures on the right and the further right talk only about potential deeper cooperation and integration with the CANZUK countries, but when what in reality is in the UK national interest is to deepen cooperation with both and to try and find ways to create deep agreements and deep alignment between the two, acting as a fulcrum between CANZUK and the EU and its associates. My experience of government was that so much of what we do already is already in that format, but that the UK has been a little too hesitant to sort of name that candidate grouping out of concerns about how the United States may react to it. But I think we are now in a different geopolitical situation after Trump has cranked up his foreign politics in terms of attacking the Labour government, attacking the Prime Minister. So I think that is an area to explore. If you'd like to give me some more time, I could talk about geopolitical threats as well, but that was the contribution I wanted to make.
Okay. So that there are two additional categories to middle powers beyond European ones, the Kanzak and Japan, South Korea, and your concern is that there is more space for engagement with them, and that would have a benefit.
So I just think that there's been an extremely vague conversation about middle powers, which doesn't help. The foreign policy world tends to focus on what can we do with middle powers, but who are you talking about? And there are a whole host of countries that are quote unquote middle powers, such as Brazil, where there's actually not very much we can do with them. When I was working for David Lammy when he was Foreign Secretary, we repeatedly tried to invite the Brazilians to come to Chevening to have a serious strategic conversation. Nothing happened because their interests just don't overlap strategically and geopolitically in a very deep way with us. They're focused in their own hemisphere, they're focused in their own region. If you look at a country like Thailand, is that a middle power? Yeah, it is. Look at Indonesia, is that a middle power? Absolutely. Is there some deep, untapped strategic relationship where the Foreign Office should be putting its resources and the Foreign Secretary should be putting his time around? Kind of not really. There are, for me, only three categories of middle powers where you can have a deep strategic relationship. They are the West traditional security allies in East Asia, South Korea and Japan. There's always going to be quite a limited amount you can do with them, but they should absolutely not be ignored. Then you have the Kanzak countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK, that are a genuine category where you can do a hell of a lot of deep military integration. You can do a lot more with them than's currently being done. They can act far more as a grouping together. And then you have the European Union and its associates. And I think instead of having a conversation vaguely about middle powers, we need to be a lot more precise. And I think the UK has a role to play in trying to deepen cooperation in that Kanzak format, deepen cooperation with the EU, and to try and bring those Kanzak countries in the EU together to do a lot more common geopolitics together, acting as a fulcrum. And that really is about how can you bring the non-US West together to meet the challenges of the moment. And that's why I think it's just not helpful to talk very vaguely about middle powers as if we're going to have the same kind of deep strategic relationship with Indonesia or Chile as we are with Australia, Canada, or Germany.
Ben, just really briefly, what's the barrier to that? You alluded to it being a political or a narrative barrier. Are there any others?
It's not a kind of political or narrative barrier. It's just like Brazil, Chile, Indonesia, these other middle powers. They're not interested in the war in Ukraine.
What's the barrier to further engagement with the Canada,
Australia?
Sorry.
I think that from my experience in the Foreign Office is that the British establishment has been very nervous about doing things in what it views as a Five Eyes minus the US format, and the reason was it was frightened about provoking some kind of political attack from the Trump administration. The political attack's already happened, so I think we're on the other side of that. Now, I think that it's very important in talking about that Kanzak format to just because the political right presents it as a fantasy, as if it's going to be some sort of British Empire 2.0 or some sort of federation, just because that is retarded, doesn't mean that we can't talk about a separate category where we can do a lot more together, where the United States has simply vacated the terrain. Lots of development we could do together, electoral interference, election observations, a whole category there where it would be too slow, or we're just not offered to do that with the Europeans in the same way we would if we were an EU member. So you can boost up a lot of
Very much.
cooperation in the candidate countries faster, and then acting as a little mini block, try and do more with the European Union. So you have a bit of an axis between those countries that have a lot in common and the European countries that have a lot in common. And that, I think, is a good geopolitical role for the UK. And I would suggest not sort of chasing windmills, as I find myself doing in trying to repeatedly get Brazilians or Indonesians or Thais to see themselves in these geopolitical struggles that we have, such as the war in Ukraine. They're just not ever going to see that in the same way as we are.
Could I add one thing to build on? Sorry, I don't want to take us off the agenda, but just
Please do.
the yeah, I think it was very really helpful point that this like vast swathe of countries that we might call middle powers is not a particularly helpful categorization, but around the Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK point, there is very clearly appetite, particularly from Canada. And there's been some criticism that Carney's speech at Davos, for example, was great rhetoric, but where's the detail? But I think there have been some really interesting moves in terms of Canada being interested, obviously Canada joining the SAFE program. I'm sure we'll get into SAFE in a second. Canada being interested in some of these formats, like a new defense and security resilience bank. So mechanisms to back up public spending and channel private spending into shared defense priorities with the Europeans, including the UK. There's real interest from the Australians who are investing significant amounts of money in AUKUS. That deal for them is going to help them rebuild significant defense capabilities, but they're really worried about the way the US is behaving in regards to that deal. So I think to Ben's point that for these things to work, we can't just have the conversation with ourselves about the countries that would be interesting to collaborate with. We have to identify countries that have shown mirroring political and strategic interests in working with us, and there's genuine momentum and political appetite there, even if they too are struggling to some degree with exactly what kind of detail, what kind of meat should we put on the bone. There's opportunity, I think, and we hear that a lot from their officials.
And in terms of UK politics, that means Labour. Essentially, it means people in Labour and on the British left not viewing cooperating more with CANZUK as imperial nostalgia and seeing that it can be a kind of genuine format in which we can achieve our objectives. But also, and this is probably too much to hope for, it would mean figures on the right not seeing deeper integration and cooperation with the European Union as somehow against our interests, but I can't really speak for them.
I wonder, Philip, so would you like to add anything to that? Because I think that will help shape our further discussion as well.
Oh, I mean, I think Britain's only role, really powerful role, can be if it can be active as a bridge between countries like Canada and Australia into Europe and out. Britain on its own isn't that important. And we talk about a mid-ranking power, but in historical terms, actually a power with Britain's GDP would be considered a small power. It doesn't have, it isn't that large part of a global economy compared to other powers. And so really, and its military posture is unfortunately improper because it's been built up to try to work with the USA. So it doesn't really have a military posture that will appeal to other powers, and doesn't have the economic weight or dynamism right now, sadly, to appeal to those other powers. So I would think it does have a role and can play a very important role if it wishes to help link up these powers to Europe as a whole. I mean, as Ben was saying, Canada really wants strong relations with the UK and Europe. I mean, it sees this as a really important relationship for it to have now. And the UK could play that role. The thing that mystifies me, and I mean, it seems to me British politics is in a weird state where they're, if not rejoining, close relationship with the EU is now wildly popular, but no party seems to be pushing it the way they should. So that something that is overwhelmingly supported by the British people, the political system isn't actually creating parties that are taking that forward in the way they should. But that's a political question, and I don't know how we get along it, particularly since the largest party in the polling now is avowedly anti-European.
Thank you, Phillips. Rachel, did you have any other questions you wanted to raise? Thanks, Rachel. I'm passing over to John Clark. Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you, Karma. I want to echo Karma's thanks to the three of you, Olivia, Phillips and Ben. I mean, we are very privileged to have the three of you, very brilliant, distinguished people, joining us and sharing your views. So many thanks for that. My name is John Clark. I'm a former European Commission Director for International Trade, ambassador to the WTO and the UN. So I'm not a defence expert. I'm a trade expert. I'm also the only Yorkshireman on the Trade and Business Commission, I think. What I would like to ask you is, and I would love to delve more deeply into the security issue and the defence issue, but that's not my competence. In a nutshell, what do you think has been the change, if any, in the last year in the UK-EU relationship since the last summit, perhaps? Yeah, have geopolitical events, Gaza, Iran, the continued Russian invasion, Trump's pariah policies, have they changed in any significant major ways the UK-EU relationship, and if so, in what way? That's my basic question.
Do you want to take that one first, Phillips?
Yeah,
okay.
Whoever wants to go first. Yeah.
I'll say a little bit about defense. I'm not but I'll leave the EU as a whole to Ben and Olivia. For defense, I've seen more positive noise in the last month or two. I really think in 2025 it was mostly a failure because there was a desperate attempt to keep the US on board, or at least there was a full self-delusion that the UK could keep the US on board. And therefore, when it came to defense, that the British seemed to me, and talking to particularly people in the Baltics and the Nordics and Northern Europe, actually to not be taking advantage of a real opportunity the British had to lead with things like the JEF. I mean, you'll hear a lot of regret about British policy if you talk to people in the Baltics and Nordics, because they wanted the British to play a much more leading role in defense, but the British seemed to not take that opportunity up because it was thought as something that would have led to trouble with the United States. I detect that there is less worry about that, perhaps more eagerness. What I don't see is actually the push to do it that I would like to see more. There are conversations, I know, but the British fallback position tends to be, okay, let's have a coalition of the willing, or do these things bilaterally. And if that's really the way it's going to go, it's probably not going to go anywhere. So my view on defense is there has been a change recently in overall tone, which is positive, but I'm not quite sure it's there to cross the Rubicon and understand what needs to be done. I would love to see the JEF taken forward. It seems to me that is an absolute natural body for the British to play a leading role. I don't know if people know what I mean by the JEF. That's sort of a widely known phrase, but the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is basically a grouping of Northern European states and their militaries. And it provides an ideal grouping of states for the UK to play a role in helping coordinate European defense. And actually, those states would like it. They've been quite frustrated by the British holding back on them in the way they read it. So I would say that would be the step I would like to see immediately.
Can follow if on the question of practical developments following the first EU-UK summit. I mean, I would share the general sense that I think we're all getting at, which is that there have been some positive developments, but overall, I think it's fallen short of what's required. I think there's a general historical trend that the EU tends to act and tends to get very creative in response to crises. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference represented a real shock. And then Starmer winning the big majority meant I think we went into that first EU-UK summit with a lot of momentum. But if you look over the course of the past year, I mean, firstly, the common understanding that was signed at that summit, there were around 20 areas of cooperation agreed. Just from a sort of practical former official perspective, I think that's arguably too many. There's a bit of a habit, I think, to list a lot of things and agree to sort of talks about talks, and some of those that maybe should have been easier wins, working together on international development assistance, doing more on economic security. I don't think we've seen as much progress as we could have. The signing of the Security and Defence Partnership, which also happened at that summit, should have obviously been the open door for participation in SAFE. And I think that has been the real disappointment of this year. And yes, talks are back on track, and the UK may agree access to the second round of loans being agreed under that programme. But a lot of loans have already been agreed in the first round. SAFE itself is temporary. It's the EU backing loans from 2025 to 2030, obviously, and then those loans will pay out over a longer period of time. But we missed a real window there. And I think it is a real shame. And I think there's significant short-sightedness on both sides. I have to say, from my own perspective, I don't know why the EU was asking reportedly around 10% of the UK's annual defence budget to access that programme when we have a shared strategic problem here, which is the need to build a more autonomous defence industrial base. And I think there's some real problems with officials perhaps falling back into sort of old habits or goals that they are used to being directed towards, including protecting their own defence industries. So, you know, the creation of SAFE itself is a good sign. Canada joining SAFE is interesting and good. I think the real prize here is the prospect of a kind of more permanent approach to European defence industrial planning, spending and procurement. So I think it's important that the UK and the EU agree access to SAFE. I mean, just to clarify, because it's the first step in this idea of joint spending and joint procurement and planning and thinking together about what does that look like in a world where we must be less reliant on the US defense industry and US defense and security guarantees. But thinking about a long-term permanent European defense industrial program as the next step, what comes after SAFE, and I think the UK thinking about how it can get involved in, influence that, be part of that, and therefore be part of what will be plans, spending that will have a long-term life, because, you know, all of this military procurement and building up a defence takes time. So some green shoots, but overall not really meeting the moment would be my assessment of the past year. And I think in particular on the joint defence spending, joint approaches to channeling private sector spending into defence, joint defence planning, that's where there really needs to be thinking about what's the longer term ways of working together that we need to agree now.
And John, you're on mute.
That's a very, very, very great conclusion you made, Olivia. I think over to Ben now for his additions to that to this debate.
I think that the UK and the EU, following the kind of reset initiated by the new Labour government, have achieved a normal relationship that's in terms of how they are dealing with each other. We turn the page on the acrimony and resentment and most, if not all, of the briefing wars of the past. I think that a lot of positive things were achieved at the EU-UK summit, but I share the group's assessment that there is a lack of urgency and speed and depth to where we are headed. Geopolitically, I think that this has been quite an important time in watching up close how the leaders and how the foreign ministers and national security advisors are working together. There has principle with Europeans, president or the Secretary of State or the NSA to lead and then offer thoughts and proposals or reflections around them, to now what we have seen, which is European leaders, foreign ministers, and NSAs increasingly working as a team that come up with a set of ideas together and then take them to work, take them towards the relevant American. The UK has actually played quite an important role in this. I think, in particular, to quote a senior Trump administration official, the National Security Advisor Jonathan Powell has been seen by them as the dean of the European NSAs, able to confederate them, bring them together, have a set of common proposals to crises like Ukraine or Gaza, and that has allowed the UK to play a interesting diplomatic role. In terms of the leaders and the foreign ministers, I think it's now clearly been established, and it's very much public as well, how the Prime Minister working either in an E3, E4 format or a slightly larger format is really participating in a team of European leaders that then will then go to Washington. The most iconic images of this are after the Trump-Putin Alaska summit. We see that team of Europeans, a team which includes Zelensky and includes Ukraine, working in Washington. I think that the UK has achieved quite a lot of diplomatic influence, and I think it has moved on quietly from simple followership of the United States. One thing that I was really stunned to see up close in government is just the depth of the UK-Ukrainian relationship. Most of this is classified. It will not be revealed until the history books come out, but it is absolutely astounding, and I was still really surprised to see the true depths of this. The relationship between the UK and Ukraine genuinely is a special relationship, and it's not for nothing that the Russians are so hostile to the UK and that the Ukrainians see the UK as their number one strategic ally. I think the coalition for the willing is quite important because it foreshadows a future relationship between the United States and Europe where a alliance and a security guarantee still exists, but it's a more minimal security guarantee than we have currently, with the Europeans doing most of the running with Kanzuk partners of guaranteeing their own security. I think that the UK has played a really important diplomatic role behind the scenes on all of this. However, I think this brings us back to the question of rearmament. And one thing that I am concerned about is this moment of strategic relevance for the UK could be as it fills the void left by the partial departure of the United States from its own role, could just be a sort of fleeting moment between two European security orders. One primarily structured and guaranteed around the United States, moving towards one primarily structured and guaranteed around Germany in collaboration with France, because Germany is rearming at an unprecedented rate, at a historic rate. And ultimately, we know from history that those willing to spend and deploy and maintain a dominant army are those that ultimately come to be the most politically important. And neither the UK nor France are ready for or have really internalized or understood what the geopolitics of Europe are going to look like in 10 years from now, when that new German army comes online, is deployed, and what a Europe with Germany genuinely spending 3.5% of defence, which the UK and France, for the moment, are not doing, will look like. Just a kind of parting reflection, Britain is haunted by various barbs made towards us in the post-war years by Americans, most famous of which is by Dean Acheson, that the UK had sort of lost an empire and not found a role. I actually think that that's been rendered obsolete by that comment by the United States abandoning a lot of its previous role. And what I saw in government was, in the transition from the Biden administration to the Trump administration, was countries previously seeing their relationship with the UK and checking in with the UK on the way geopolitically to Washington, not viewing the relationship with the UK as a sort of genuine and meaningful geopolitical relationship in and of itself, to a lot of those bilateral relationships coming alive. And now there's a whole series of countries around the world, not simply candidate countries or European countries or Ukraine, but also a variety in the Middle East and beyond, from Jordan to Qatar or the UAE, that see their relationship with the UK as an independent alliance with its own objectives. So I push back on those that saying that the UK doesn't have a role, but my question is whether or not that role can be more than a fleeting moment guaranteed by some intelligence resources, some specialist resources, and some diplomatic or special forces resources, and not one that can be maintained down the line if there is not the necessary level of rearmament that can create those quickly perimeter deployable forces that have been so lacking, as we've seen around Cyprus.
Thank you, Ben. John, I'm going to move the conversation
yes,
on.
just to say that Karma, we'll move on to the next questions and speakers. But I just want to say that this has been the most brilliant conversation we've had in this commission in the last year and a half since I've been a member. And I think we're very lucky to have these three extraordinary people with us. And I really think we should try to, if we can persuade them, to organise a half day or with them on all of these issues to do with defence, economic security, the trade issue, the middle power issue, which the shimmer of middle power status, which Ben mentioned. So a big thanks to these three absolutely extraordinary people that have agreed to join us today. But now over to the next questioner. Thank you.
Here, John, and thank you very much. And I'm passing over to Deborah.
Thank you very much. So I'm very conscious that time is speeding along, and I'm supposed to be asking your questions at about 11:10. So we are about 15 minutes, I think, behind time. So just want to kick off, and I seem to have two parts of a question as well. It just makes it a bit more complicated. So the first one, and if I could come to Professor Phillips on that would be good. Given that the UK and EU member states already cooperate extensively through NATO, intelligence sharing and sanctions coordination, what practical difference will a UK EU formal defence partnership make?
Thanks very much. I actually wouldn't trust the US with valuable intelligence right now. So I would be very wary about using NATO if it's going to go to the US. I wouldn't, the head of the US intelligence agencies are not entirely trustworthy. What gets to the White House is not entirely trustworthy. So I do not believe NATO is actually this body now that the UK can rely on for intelligence. I think it will come down to cooperation with Europe. And I actually give it the good news and the bad news. The good news is if European states do what they say, and the UK among them, and get to 3.5% in defense in the coming decade, that is actually a well-timed opportunity. It's an opportunity because they will be spending money having learned the lessons of where they are and how strategy is developed and how security is developed. So they won't have to waste a lot of that money building things they do not need. I mean, had this rise in defense spending happened 10 years ago, my guess is most of it would have been wasted because they would have built the kinds of systems and constructed the kinds of militaries that we see now that everyone's desperately trying to get out of. So Europe has an opportunity, if the states actually get to that 3.5%, that they will be investing at the right time. And that was utterly fortuitous, but it is true. Not only that, they need this investment. That I've been struck about the real divergence between the US and European states when it comes to development of high-tech industries and whatever. The relative decline for Europe, you can almost directly match to the decline in European defense spending vis-a-vis the USA. Now, I'm not saying it's causal, but there's certainly a weird correlation between it. Europe is absolutely at the top of many high-tech industries in the 1990s. when compared to the US, but then Europeans decide not to spend any money on defense, and they actually drop out of competition in many of those areas. Now, this investment, it's not going to make up all of that difference at all, but a really well-targeted investment at defense industries, particularly in areas like autonomous systems, is a very important part of Europe's future. So that could be a benefit to helping Europe and the UK push their economies along. So this is the opportunity. The problem they face is right now there's no structure to coordinate it. And this is really worrying. That about a year and a half ago, Edward Stringer and I wrote an article on Foreign Affairs, which was, we thought, a very anodyne piece saying Europe should get ready for Trump. Came out in September of 2024, which is hardly a radical time to say that, as Trump was the Republican nominee, and it was a 50-50 chance he was going to win the election. And what we found is, one, there was huge resistance to even facing that question. But then no one wanted to take on some fundamental issues, which is, if you are going to invest for European defense by European states, you have to have some agency, or agency even might be too formal a word, but some way to make sure the spending is efficient. So by ways of comparison, the United States maintains about 30 to 40 military systems. That's what the US military is based on. A system is an aircraft of a certain type, a tank of a certain type, an artillery piece. So the US military maintains 30 to 40 different systems. That's what it builds. The European states maintain between 130 to 140. So not only was Europe spending much less than the US, it was spending it in many more systems, many of which don't work together. The wild inefficiencies of having 4 times as many systems with half the spend are the kind of things that we're seeing why European countries have been relatively unimportant in world defense terms for a while. Now, if they continue to do that, if everyone just gets to 3.5% and just spends what they want on what they want, you will have far less bang for your buck from that transformation. And that's the worry. So this is actually an opportunity if properly done. And my worry is that neither European states or the UK are really grasping this fundamental problem, is that they have to coordinate it. They have to have, there can be one kind of 155 artillery piece that a few states build. There can be one type of frigate, one type of vehicle. They have to share this work out. So European states need to think they're not going to have a lot of very small slices of different pies, but to think about, all right, I'm going to get a few much bigger slices of a few pies. And if they can start thinking that way about defense, and actually trusting their partners to allow them to spend their money in that way, that would be a very positive thing. But when it boils down to these things like, say, fighting over money, that just leads me to despair. That means they're not taking it seriously, and it's still a one-upmanship game within European states. And if European states still see the big thing here is to triumph over each other, then they're not going to get anywhere.
So, all of you have basically said the same kind of thing. You've all identified the same kind of problems, which is an inability to face the reality and to then work collaboratively together. So can I just ask a little follow-up question? How do we get governments across Europe and in the UK to face the reality and actually do something, instead of doing kind of performative politics, which doesn't get us anywhere?
Can I answer that question first? Having been in government, it's not just a question about governments. It's a question about the European public and what the European public genuinely thinks and what sacrifices it is genuinely willing to make. If we look at all the polling trends in the UK as regards public finances, they are going in the wrong direction for a serious and sustained UK rearmament program, which we all on this call agree is necessary, and the entire foreign policy and diplomatic world would agree is necessary. Politicians are, by their nature in democratic societies, always responding and to reflecting to where the public are. So I don't think we can leave that out of our analyses.
Right. So we need some truth telling from politicians by the sounds of things.
Well, I think that it's not just a question of truth telling. The public has been told repeatedly by politicians about the gravity of the situation. It's just, we are facing a situation where, in order to fund a major rearmament program, other domestic investments or other domestic public programs, from welfare to funding old age pensioners through the triple lock, would have to be significantly cut back on. And that's not a conversation that the British public has shown in polling itself to be ready for. And there are a lot of things that go into shaping into the public's attitudes, which politicians are only one part. But I think we can't be, there are serious trade-offs the European public's going to have to make if it's going to make these kind of investments. But I don't think that the voters are ready for that, or appreciate that, or would vote for that on the scale that the foreign policy, diplomatic, and defence world believes is necessary. I don't think it's simply a question of politicians talking to them, though. I think there's a wider cultural issue that we don't live in the early 21st century in a kind of society like we did in the 1950s, or even in the 1970s and the 1980s, where there was an understanding that significant sacrifices needed to be made in the name of defence. We're in a very different society.
Right, thank you. So I'm going to go on to the second part of the question now, because I'm conscious.
Deborah, I wonder whether you mentioned that we're running a little bit late, and I wonder whether actually I think we've covered the defence issue quite well. I wonder whether this is an opportune moment to move on to economic security, unless you disagree.
Well, I was actually going to just go to Olivia for the last part of the question, and then come back to you. So yeah, I was making everything shorter. So very quickly, Olivia, 2 minutes. Given the failure to secure UK participation in the EU's Safe Defence Fund to date, does this reflect political choices by the EU or their structural limits? So just very quickly.
I think, well, yeah, in the interest of time, to some extent, I think we've touched on this. Ben might have more insight, having been in government when this was happening. But my sense is, I've kind of underlined what I mentioned before, that I think officials are falling back into the habits of a lifetime, potentially particularly on the French side, maybe in some other member states too. That the sort of inbuilt directive is around looking after your own defence industries, being concerned about the EU-ness of the EU defence industrial base that SAFE is intended to be a contribution to building. And it requires really significant political momentum, I think, to get people past that. I might just add to what Ben said on the fiscal challenges. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has done some great work on this. Like the commitments that we've made on defence spending, even the ones that we've made, let alone any further goals, are really challenging. And the last time we were spending as much on defence as we're aiming to spend, we were spending about half what we're projected to spend on health in the 2030s. So one of the reasons I think the interest here might be in joint EU mechanisms to backstop, support, or otherwise that spending, or otherwise channel private funding into defence spending, is precisely because, at the very least, making that a shared problem and building shared mechanisms and recognising the gravity of that problem together might help address it. But yeah, politicians are responding to what is a really, the fiscal challenge is really difficult on this. So it's yeah, I think that's one of the, not just a sort of lack of understanding of the situation or communication of the situation, I think.
Okay, thank you very much, Olivia. Back to you, Karma.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you, Olivia and Ben, for keeping those responses short. We're moving on. We've been joined by Tamara Chinchik, who's one of our commissioners, and Tamara's going to pose the next question. Thank you, Tamara.
Thank you. It's actually Tamara, but thank you. Olivia, this question is for you. Economic security, particularly access to critical raw materials, energy resilience, and protection from economic coercion, has become a priority for both London and Brussels. How much scope is there for meaningful UK-EU cooperation in these areas, do you think?
Thank you. And I'm sure that Phillips and Ben might have thoughts on this as well, which I'd be really interested here too. We've spent a lot of time on defence and security. I think it is worth a nod to the ways in which the shifts in the global trade order have been and will make life very difficult for a country outside of a larger trade bloc, historically very dependent on open trade. Since 2023, China has pretty consistently engaged in choking off supplies of critical minerals and other critical economic inputs in response to disputes with the EU, in response to disputes with other countries. And we've seen the way the US has been behaving on tariffs and on export controls, actually increasingly volatile, and I think makes the sort of the prospects of trade becoming a site of coercion, of, to borrow Ben's phrase, foreign politics, is also very worrying. I think there are prospects for EU-UK cooperation here. Both sides of that coin are exposed to those risks. There's probably three areas that we should be thinking about: joint protective measures, joint defensive measures, and potentially joint approaches to upholding the vast majority of global trade, which is still undertaken under predictable rules. On the first, the UK has brought in 2021 investment screening measures to manage the risk that China, but other adversarial states as well, develop undue ownership or influence over kind of critical sectors or critical national infrastructure. The EU has also brought in an FDI regulation that seeks to bring member states' standards for investment screening up. I think, put simply, there's a case for alignment, because if we're concerned about undue Chinese or other investment or ownership in infrastructure here, we should probably also be concerned about the prospect of that in Greece or in Germany, because we're part of the same regional economy and in some cases the same energy and transport infrastructure. So I think there might be prospects to harmonise our approaches, at the very least to share our assessment of the risk, to share approaches. On the second, that's a kind of protective measure, right? And then there's the question of what can we do to defend against the prospects of coercion. The EU has brought in the anti-coercion instrument, which allows it as a framework that allows it to identify coercion, to agree measures across the EU to counter, right? And I think that was brought in initially, and the idea was hopefully it would never be used. It would just have a deterrent effect, and it would enable actions outside of referring cases to the WTO, which take a very long time to be agreed or resolved. The UK is not in the same position, doesn't need an instrument in the same way, because we're not a 27 member state bloc. But I think the process that the EU has gone through in naming the prospect of coercion, at least doing the joint thinking about when would we say that that is happening, and when would steps to respond kick in, and what might they be, is a useful thing for the UK to learn from. And I think an ambitious goal in future might be that we act together in response to coercion. And then finally, on the third, I can see David Hennig is on this call, and I think he's a bit sceptical about this prospect.
Very unlike David to be sceptical in any way whatsoever.
But I do think, we've heard a lot of noises, again, from Carney and again and Canada, about whether, at a very basic level, the EU and the CPTPP could at least sort of think strategically together about these threats to the global trade order, and could think about the processes for managing trade abuses, or think about a joint approach to managing any really concentrated dependencies on countries that we're worried about. In general, we share, this is another risk that I think we share, even if we have different economic structures and in some cases very different economic interests. At the very least, the threat of serious coercion by China or by the US, and a more ambitious approach would look like a joint strategy around some protective, some defensive, and some sort of how you uphold global trade type measures to both manage the prospect of American tariffs, American volatility, and kind of Chinese weaponization of choke points. So I think it should be on the agenda. It was on the agenda of the reset. It was part of the common understanding, but I think there's kind of more that could be done, particularly as we see our kind of security interests overlapping with our economic interests in this regard.
So thank you. I mean, I know I think we're just catching up on time, but before I ask our other interviewees, whatever the correct word is, sorry, I'm losing my voice, so I'm a bit waffly today. I'm on paracetamol, but I'm doing a piece of research separately around onshoring of PPE and uniforms. Thank you, Ben. And I would like to ask the Secretariat if I could reach out to the people that we've got on today, because I think it's a very interesting area. I was trying to advise the previous government on onshoring PPE during the COVID crisis, and we saw that we were buying from China and we were selling to America. And given that there's this volatility, it begs the question of why we're not looking at that across all of defence, including uniforms. So I will pick that up if that's all right with the Secretariat to reach out to you individually. And Ben and Philip, if you've got any other points to bring in before I hand back to the chair, please speak now or forever hold your peace.
I'll be incredibly quick.
Thank
And
you.
that is simply to say, if you buy things and don't make it, what we're realizing is that's almost useless to do. And
100%.
yeah, that's what we're doing. And this in my area of defense. If you actually just buy it and don't make it, it's almost better not to have it. Because if you lose it, you can't replace it, and you're stuck. So you're never going to be resilient in everything. That's the reality. But you have to be resilient in fundamentals, and that has to be the basis for planning.
I'm inclined personally, I'm not speaking for the Secretariat, but I would agree with you given the research I'm doing. Ben, over to you before I hand back to the chair.
I just want to make again the point that I made earlier, which is, when you're in government and when you're working for a cabinet minister and when you spend time in number 10, it's so clear that this country is under such enormous financial pressures to deliver for the public in so many different terrains. Critical lack of housing, healthcare service that needs urgent investment. Please don't get me started about the state of our prisons, about the state of our courts, about the state of our national databases, the kind of moth-eaten state of our civil service. And the public has acute and fierce demands about all of these things that are affecting their everyday lives, from a serious problem of petty crime, a lack of transport infrastructure about vast swathes of the country, matters of inequality, the disastrous state of old age care in this country. And I think we cannot ever forget, as foreign policy experts and diplomatic experts, that our politicians are having to make choices in that matrix, and which any politician, regardless of party, is always going to want to match up public spending to where the public's number one concerns are, because that's the nature of a democracy. And we don't live in a society in Europe where the public believe, as it currently stands, that the geopolitical situation is that bad that they should need to divert resources away from the police, the healthcare system, the pension system in that direction. And I don't think these conversations, I become quite frustrated in coming out of government, seeing that a lot of the foreign policy debate isn't linked back to that. One issue that I tried to push in government to try and correct this was urging that we needed a change in communication approach about foreign policy and security policy, which is traditionally a government wants to communicate that things are good and that things are positive and that things are under control. And I urged a different approach in which we would declassify a lot more than we currently do, to expose the public to actually how bad things are, to make them understand why they might need to make trade-offs. That approach was not taken and has not been taken.
I guess it doesn't align with the creative growth agenda.
It doesn't, no. And that's the fundamental thing, is that there are real painful, difficult trade-offs here, and the Treasury is always going to not want to give money to the Ministry of Defence with its absolutely appalling track record on public procurement, financial black
100%.
holes, if it can possibly get away from it.
Thank you. Back to you, Chair, and thank you for bearing with me on this, with my voice. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Tamara, and our witnesses, and apologies for my previous mispronunciation. I'm going to pass the conversation now to Jeff. We are sort of running slightly behind time, so I think if we could, bearing in mind the very rich conversations we've had so far and the rich evidence we've had so far, keep the responses quite short. We've already covered quite a lot of the ground, but I'll pass to Jeff to kind of frame his question. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chair. I come into this conversation from an industry and trade perspective, and trying desperately to ignore what Ben just said, because that's a whole series of boxes and soapboxes I'd like to clamber onto myself. Could I just go back to the conversation about the relationship between Europe and the US and China? I just wonder, would the panel like to continue to make some remarks about how they think this is going to progress? And would they like to shoot the breeze for a minute about future presidencies and how they fit together? Olivia, would you like to comment briefly?
Sorry, my mouse got stuck, but sure. Yeah, I'll be brief because I'm keen to hear what the others have to say. I think one of the most critical questions for us is, what's the future political trajectory of the US? In particular, what's the trajectory of the US right? The coalition around Trump is fractious. For a long time, I think there was a bit of a fashion to describe Trump and describe MAGA as transactional. This idea that there's a kind of, everything's very cost benefit. If we can give them something they want, we'll get things that we want. We can manage them in that way. And I think the experience of the past year has shown that even if there are elements within the MAGA coalition that think a bit more in that way, that are just basically extremely self-interested in America first, but at least broadly predictable in that. I think the past year has shown that it's other camps within the MAGA coalition, what we might call the civilizational camp. Some people use that term, that are a bit more in the ascendant. So that is the camp that I would say is J.D. Vance is an example of, that are much more interested, and not just self-interested, they're actually interested in other countries' politics. They're interested in getting involved and interfering in our approaches to regulating technology, to our own defense, to issues on speech. And then on foreign policy, similarly, there was this kind of fashion to describe them as isolationist. I mean, we've all seen, even in terms of their promises to voters about not getting involved again in forever wars in the Middle East. Again, it's other camps that are much more expansionist, that are now in the ascendant. So you have a very fractious coalition, which does mean that coalition could break apart, but it also means I think it's quite difficult to know what the successor trend might be. I think if it's the kind of civilizational Vance camp, they're much less keen on foreign wars in that regard, but they are perfectly comfortable with interfering in other countries' politics, and I think align with some of the language that you saw in the US national security strategy about it being an active US goal to subvert the trajectory of politics in European countries. So I think we need to be very prepared for the idea that either of these camps, the kind of expansionist foreign policy camp or the very civilizational kind of prepared to interfere in other countries' politics camps, might succeed Trump on the MAGA side. On the left, I think it's a much more open field. But I think one thing we can be clear about is there's not going to be a return to an Atlanticist, old school American foreign policy, right? So there's still not going to be any appetite to play the kind of security role in Europe that America previously played, even if they are likely to be more aligned with our concerns on Ukraine and more aligned politically. I think I'll maybe stop there because I'm curious to hear what others have to say, and I've got an eye on the time. But I think right or left, we're likely to see neither a return to the old defense order, nor in fact a return to the old trade order. I think America's much on the right, more comfortable with imposing tariffs, using trade ties as tools to get what they want from other countries, and on the left, much more comfortable with strategic industrial policy, which will also sort of change the game for us and did change the game a bit under Biden. So in sum, not expecting a snapback. And on either side, there's a variety of different camps that we need to be paying attention to and preparing for the way they will shift and undermine what have been quite consistent foreign policy assumptions about the US.
Olivia, thanks very much. Ben, could you just take on from there? And I threw in the word resilience when we talk about Europe. Where does that all come together and what does it look like for industry?
I guess one thing I'd like to talk about, which we have not discussed yet, especially as relates to industry, is the question of China. And anyone familiar with any chart published in this century knows that China is the dominant technological, industrial, pharmaceutical, raw materials trend. Almost in any metric that one looks, one sees this astonishing leap ahead of the power and progress of China. One thing that I found working with the Democrats was that the primary interest that Jake Sullivan and the White House had in the UK was that there should be, in their words, no leakage of our fusion, biotech, AI, and quantum industries into where China is. They viewed that the golden triangle of development in those industries of the future between London, Cambridge, and Oxford is really of critical importance to the Western map of power in the 21st century. And they were very keen for a mixture of inducements and pressure, but mostly pressure to make sure that that fully aligned with where the United States is. And that was where they saw that expert class of highly sophisticated, extremely intelligent, very knowledgeable professionals who were very knowledgeable about this question of how China intersects with business. That's where they saw democratic foreign policy going if Kamala Harris had won the election. How could they confederate a global regulatory scientific bloc to stand up to China and to make China behave more like a market actor and less like a piratical actor? And how could they force China to stop doing its sort of non-market practices, such as sort of flooding the market with cheap and subsidized manufacturers, which are having absolutely terrible effects on European industry, as you will of course know coming from an industry side. Trump has essentially led that conversation to be dropped at a political level because he's not interested in leading it in the same way. There was a lot of projection, I think, coming into the Trump 2.0 administration in thinking that it was going to be an anti-China administration. I think it isn't. It's just a Trump administration with his own sui generis approach to China. We shouldn't forget that he invited Xi Jinping to his inauguration, and he's seeking some kind of deal with the Chinese and has actually allowed those Blackwell NVIDIA AI chips to be sold to the Chinese, not really clearly for what in return, something that never would have happened under a democratic administration. Working in the Foreign Office, I found that very broadly, our Middle East team, our America team, our Russia-Ukraine team were all excellent and were all of a global standard. But the China team, I felt really wasn't. I felt that the Foreign Secretary just wasn't exposed to regular debates about China and to regular debates about China as a global actor, as far as all of these technologies and processes and trade flows and manufacturing and mineral flows were concerned. And I was extremely worried about the quality of the work that was coming up, which struck me as deeply insufficient. Having lived and worked in Washington previously, I think that there's no comparison between the quality of the debate about China that you get in Washington, in which these topics are regularly discussed and debated, and what has happened to the State Department. I don't know if it's stuck, but what happened to the State Department under Biden is they built what was called China House to really expose Tony Blinken regularly to these debates. That's just simply not the case in the Foreign Office today. And I'm concerned that the pace of crisis right now is leading us to forget about that and to forget about the urgency of that down the line. Thank you.
Phillips, just before I come to you, could I hand on to John to widen the conversation? John, over to you, please.
Thanks very much, Jeff, being very, very mindful of the time. First question to Professor Phillips, then to Ben, and then hopefully we'll get time to go to Olivia. Looking ahead, do you expect UK-EU cooperation to deepen more quickly in defence and security than in trade and economic integration? And if so, why?
Brutally honestly, I would like it to, but I don't actually see it making a lot of improvements in the short term. I don't think there is the sense of urgency, partly with Ben saying the political economy questions are not positive, so that many states are trying to pretend that they don't have to spend the money and they don't have to make the kind of sacrifices they have to make. So I would like to think there would be more, but as of now, I remain more of a skeptic.
Ben?
I think that the government approached the relationship with the US in the first few months with a huge degree of political with a willingness to experiment politically, to build different political channels between the NSA, the Foreign Secretary, the Vice President, the Prime Minister. It understood this was a relationship that had to be managed politically and not merely technocratically and not through the traditional channels. It was willing to deploy a significant amount of bravery to that. I think our relationship with the EU remains locked in what is overwhelmingly a technocratic channel, and I think that we need to have far more political high-level discussions about where we want this relationship to be in 5 and 10 years between the principals themselves.
Olivia?
I agree with both of those statements. So I'll just add that I think the one aspect of this that might generate further momentum is the Trump administration's continued volatility. And, I said it earlier, but I think the EU has shown enormous creativity in response to crisis in the past. We need to generate that kind of political will and momentum to overcome these technocratic habits. And it may be that, particularly since the beginning of this year, Greenland, Iran, the Trump administration's behavior is bringing home to political actors and decision makers across Europe the seriousness of that crisis. So that is where I would see potential future impetus for achieving some of the things that all three of us have talked about on this call that as necessary. But it would be ideal if we didn't have to have crisis, right? It would be ideal if we could have that kind of political ambition and momentum come from like strategic forethought. But I recognise that so many decision makers are caught up in reacting and also caught up in the fiscal bind that it's not just the UK, many European states are in. I do expect that it will be defence and security where we probably see progress over trade and economic integration.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you to our three witnesses today. What an amazing conversation, ranging very widely, and so many questions still to be raised and answered and asked. And I think a real positive from today's conversation was the number of times that we referenced the fact that we need more conversations like this and frank conversations. And I'm very grateful to Olivia, to Phillips and to Ben for being frank in their answers and for, speaking to the points that they also wish to raise beyond the questions that we asked, which I think was an important part of taking the conversation forward. So thank you again to members of the UK Trade and Business Commission, and in particular to our witnesses today. And we look forward to taking the conversation forward on another occasion. Thank you so much for your time and your energies, and I hope for those who are not feeling well today that you recover quickly as well. Thank you.